The thunder of hooves echoed across the prairie as Francesca Dawson rode through the tall grass, her auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner of defiance. She didn't look back at the town of Redemption, Colorado. There was nothing left for her there but whispers and accusatory glances. It was 1876, and a woman with a past like hers found no mercy in a place that prided itself on righteousness. Francesca had been riding for 3 days, her provisions dwindling and her horse growing weary. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, promising shelter but also uncertainty. Her hands, once soft and pampered, were now calloused from the rains and the elements. She had learned to be hard. It was the only way to survive. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Francesca spotted a small homestead nestled against a copse of cottonwood trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the soft glow of lamplight beckoned. Her instinct was to ride on strangers rarely welcomed a woman traveling alone, but her horse had other ideas. The mare slowed, then stopped, refusing to go further without rest. "Fine," Francesca muttered, patting the animal's neck. "But at the first sign of trouble, we leave." She approached cautiously, dismounting a short distance from the modest cabin. It was well maintained, with a small garden to one side and a barn that looked recently painted. Francesca led her horse toward the water trough, listening for any sounds of danger. The door to the cabin swung open and a tall man stepped out onto the porch. He held no weapon, but his posture was alert, wary. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and resonant. "You look like you've come a long way." Francesca straightened her spine, one hand resting on the small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Just passing through. My horse needs water." The man nodded, stepping down from the porch. As he moved into the fading light, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of his shirt. His eyes, observing her with equal caution, were the color of the sky just before a storm. "Name's Matthew Reed," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "Your horse is welcome to the water, and there's a meal inside if you're hungry." "I have my own provisions," Francesca replied stiffly, though her stomach betrayed her with a growl. A small smile touched Matthew's lips. "I just took some bread from the oven, fresh baked, and there's stew." The mention of fresh bread made Francesca's resolve waver. It had been days since she'd had anything but jerky and hardtack. "I can pay," she said, her pride not allowing her to accept charity. Matthew shook his head. "No need. I don't often get visitors out here. Company would be payment enough." He didn't press further, turning back toward the cabin. "Stable's there if you want to put your horse up for the night. I'll set an extra plate." Francesca hesitated, warring between caution and exhaustion. Finally, practicality won out. She couldn't ride through the night, and a meal and shelter were too tempting to refuse. She led her mare to the stable, finding it clean and well organized. There was fresh hay and a stall ready, as if the man had been expecting company. After settling her horse, Francesca removed her saddlebags and took a moment to straighten her appearance. Her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the wall showed a woman with tired eyes and wind-tousled hair, but still proud, still fighting. The cabin was warm and smelled of yeast and herbs when she entered. Matthew moved about the small kitchen with surprising grace for a man his size, transferring a loaf of bread from the oven to the wooden table he'd set with simple but clean dishes. "Hope you like sourdough," he said, not looking up from his task. "It's what I do best." "I haven't had fresh bread in weeks," Francesca admitted, setting her saddlebags by the door, her pistol still within easy reach. "Then you're in for a treat." Matthew gestured to the table. "Please sit." "I don't stand on ceremony here." Francesca took a seat, watching as he ladled stew into earthenware bowls. There was something about his movements that spoke of care and precision. This wasn't a man who rushed through life. "You bake often?" she asked, finding the silence uncomfortable. Matthew nodded, bringing the bowls to the table. "Every day. Started when I was a boy helping my mother. Found I had a knack for it. Unusual occupation for a man living alone on the frontier. Perhaps." He sliced the bread, the crust crackling beneath the knife. "But it keeps me fed, and the ranch hands at the Double B appreciate trading beef for something other than their own cooking." As they ate, Francesca found herself relaxing slightly. The stew was hearty, the bread exceptional crusty on the outside, soft within, with a tangy flavor that lingered pleasantly. "This is good," she said after a few bites, surprised by the quality. Matthew's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Thank you. It's a simple pleasure, but one I never tire of watching people enjoy something I've made." "You didn't ask my name," Francesca noted, suddenly aware of the omission. "Figured you'd offer it if you wanted to." She considered this, then said, Francesca Dawson." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Dawson." "Mrs." she corrected automatically, then wished she hadn't when his eyes flicked to her bare ring finger. "Mrs. Dawson," he acknowledged without comment on the missing ring. "Where are you headed, if you don't mind my asking?" "West," she replied vaguely. "Perhaps California. Long journey for a woman alone," her chin lifted. "I can handle myself." "I don't doubt it." He broke off a piece of bread, seemingly unconcerned by her defensiveness. "But even the strongest rider needs rest and supplies." "Nearest town is Silver Creek, about 2 days' ride from here." The name was unfamiliar, which was a relief. Perhaps her reputation hadn't reached that far. "Is there work there?" she asked cautiously. Matthew considered. "Some, mostly in the saloons and boarding houses. There's a hotel that might need help. The mines bring in enough men to keep business steady." Francesca nodded, filing away the information. She had skills beyond those that most would assume of a woman in her position. She could read and write better than most, knew figures and accounts, could even play the piano, though that talent seemed unlikely to be of use in a mining town. As they finished the meal, she found herself studying her host more carefully. His hands were strong but gentle, the fingers bearing calluses from more than just ranch work. There were books on shelves along one wall, well-worn and clearly read often. This was no ordinary cowboy. "Thank you for the meal," she said as he collected their empty bowls. "I should see to my horse." "She's fine," Matthew assured her. "I checked while you were washing up, gave her some extra oats." Francesca stiffened. "You went through my things." "No, madam." His voice remained calm. "Just tended to the horse. Your belongings are exactly where you left them." She felt a flush of embarrassment at her accusation. "I apologize, it's been a long journey." "No apology needed." He moved to a chest in the corner of the room and pulled out a folded quilt. "You can take the bed, I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't, you could and you will," he said firmly. "It's no hardship. I fall asleep by the fire most nights anyway." Too tired to argue further, Francesca accepted the small privacy he offered. The bedroom was simply furnished but clean, with a sturdy bed covered in a handmade quilt and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to Matthew moving about in the other room. It had been so long since someone had shown her simple kindness without expecting something in return. It made her uneasy, as if waiting for the other boot to drop. Still, as she lay down, the exhaustion of days on the trail caught up with her. Despite her wariness, sleep claimed her quickly, deeper and more peaceful than she'd known in months. Morning brought the scent of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Francesca woke alert, her hand automatically reaching for her gun before she remembered where she was. Sunlight streamed through the small window, revealing a day bright with promise. She rose and straightened her clothing as best she could, running fingers through her tangled hair before braiding it back from her face. When she emerged from the bedroom, Matthew was at the table, kneading dough with rhythmic motions. He glanced up at her entrance but didn't stop his work. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's hot. There's eggs if you're hungry." "Thank you." She poured herself a cup, watching as his strong hands shaped the dough. "You're baking again." "It's what I do," he replied simply. "This will be ready by midday. Thought you might want some for your journey." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught her off guard. "That's very kind." Matthew shrugged, dusting flour from his hands. "Like I said, not many visitors. It's nice having someone to bake for besides myself and the occasional ranch hand." As Francesca sipped her coffee, she noticed a small desk in the corner, covered with papers. Matthew followed her gaze. "I keep accounts for some of the ranches around here," he explained. "Numbers make sense to me." "You're not just a baker, then?" A smile touched his lips. "Not just anything, Mrs. Dawson. None of us are." The observation, casual as it was, struck her. How long had it been since someone had seen her as more than the sum of her mistakes? I should be moving on, she said, setting down her cup. Thank you for your hospitality. Matthew nodded, returning to his bread. Trail foods by the door. I took the liberty of filling your canteen. Francesca checked her saddlebags to find them indeed stocked with jerky, dried fruit, and hardtack. Her canteen was full and cool to the touch. I can pay, she began. Consider it frontier hospitality, he interrupted. All I ask is that you do the same for someone else when you're able. The simple request, free of judgment or expectation, left her momentarily speechless. She gathered her things, including the pistol she'd kept close, and moved toward the door. Your horse is saddled, Matthew added, still focused on his dough. She seems rested enough, but I'd take it easy today all the same. Francesca paused at the threshold. Why are you helping me? Matthew looked up then, his blue-gray eyes meeting hers directly. Because everyone deserves kindness, Mrs. Dawson, even those running from something, she tensed. What makes you think I'm running? Experience, he said simply. I recognize the look. Before she could respond, he added, Silver Creek's due west. Follow the creek until it joins the river, then head north. Can't miss it. With a nod of thanks, Francesca stepped out into the morning light. Her mare was indeed saddled and waiting, looking refreshed from the night's rest. As promised, Matthew had not touched her personal belongings, the small bundle of her past life still securely tied behind the saddle. She mounted up, casting one last glance at the cabin. Matthew had stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth. For a moment, she considered asking if he knew of specific work in Silver Creek or if there was a message she could deliver for him. But such connections were dangerous. Better to remain anonymous, forgettable. With a tip of her hat, Francesca turned her horse westward and rode away from the unexpected sanctuary, unaware that her path would soon lead her back to it under very different circumstances. The journey to Silver Creek took less than the 2 days Matthew had estimated. Francesca pushed her mare harder than she should have, driven by the restlessness that had become her constant companion. The town appeared before her late on the second afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley where silver had been discovered a decade earlier. It was larger than she'd expected, with a main street boasting a hotel, several saloons, a bank, and various businesses catering to miners and the ranchers from the surrounding area. Francesca rode slowly down the dusty street, aware of the glances her arrival attracted. A woman alone always drew attention, especially one who rode astride rather than in a proper side saddle. She stopped at the livery stable first, arranging board for her horse with the last of her ready cash. The stableman, an older man with rheumy eyes, asked no questions beyond how long she planned to stay. Not certain yet, she replied, stroking her mare's nose in farewell. Depends on work. Might try the Silver Palace Hotel, he suggested, jerking his head toward a 3-story building at the end of the street. Heard they lost their bookkeeper last week. Consumption. Francesca thanked him and made her way to the hotel, her saddlebags slung over one shoulder. The lobby was modest but clean, with a polished desk and a small sitting area where 2 men in business attire were engaged in quiet conversation. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, looked up as she approached. His eyes took in her travel-worn appearance with barely concealed disapproval. May I help you, miss? I'm inquiring about the bookkeeper position, Francesca said, keeping her voice steady and professional. The clerk's eyebrows rose. The position is for a trained accountant, miss. It requires mathematical skills and I am qualified, she interrupted. I managed accounts for a shipping business in St. Louis for 3 years. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had indeed worked with the books, though as the owner's wife rather than an employee. The business had been her husband's, but the accounts had been her domain, at least until everything fell apart. The clerk looked skeptical but gestured to a door behind the desk. Mr. Hargrove is the manager. You can speak with him if you insist. Francesca found Frederick Hargrove to be unexpectedly receptive to her application, particularly after she demonstrated her facility with numbers and her neat, precise handwriting. Within an hour, she had secured not only employment, but also a small room on the hotel's top floor as part of her compensation. Previous occupant kept the books in a state, Hargrove complained, showing her to a small office adjacent to his own. Brilliant with figures but no sense of organization. Take you a week just to sort through it all, I expect. Francesca surveyed the stacks of ledgers and loose papers with a professional eye. I'll have it in order within 3 days, Mr. Hargrove. The manager's bushy eyebrows shot up. 3 days. That would be impressive indeed, Mrs. What did you say your name was again? Dawson, she replied. Francesca Dawson. Well, Mrs. Dawson, if you can perform such a miracle, there may be a bonus in it for you. He hesitated, then added delicately, May I inquire as to Mr. Dawson's whereabouts? Francesca had prepared for this inevitable question. My husband passed away, she said, the practiced words coming easily now. Influenza. Hargrove offered condolences that she accepted with a practiced nod. It was simpler this way a widow drew sympathy rather than suspicion. Few would question why she had traveled so far from her supposed home. True to her word, Francesca had the accounts organized within 3 days, working late into the night to sort through the previous bookkeeper's haphazard system. She discovered several discrepancies that, when brought to Hargrove's attention, saved the hotel a considerable sum. You're a find, Mrs. Dawson, he declared, examining her neatly penned ledgers. A genuine find. Weeks passed and Francesca settled into a routine. She kept to herself, taking meals in her room when possible and avoiding the social gatherings that occasionally took place in the hotel's dining room. Her work was exemplary, her manner professional but distant. She became a fixture at the hotel, respected but largely unknown. Then came the day when a familiar face appeared in the hotel lobby. Francesca was crossing from her office to the front desk when she spotted Matthew Reed speaking with the clerk. He looked much as she remembered, though he'd traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and vest. Her first instinct was to retreat unnoticed, but he turned at that moment and their eyes met. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by a smile that reached his eyes. Mrs. Dawson, he said, approaching her. It seems you found Silver Creek after all, Mr. Reed, she acknowledged, acutely aware of the clerk's curious gaze. What brings you to town? Business with the bank, he replied, and delivering some special orders. He gestured to a wooden crate near the entrance that she hadn't noticed. Cinnamon rolls for the mayor's wife's birthday. She's particular about her pastries. You've come all this way to deliver baked goods. Francesca couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Matthew chuckled. They're very good cinnamon rolls. Then, more seriously, I see you found employment. The hotel is fortunate. Before she could respond, Hargrove emerged from his office. Ah, Mrs. Dawson, there you are. I need the quarterly figures for he broke off, noticing Matthew. Mr. Reed, don't tell me it's delivery day already. Right on schedule, Mr. Hargrove. Matthew nodded toward a second crate by the door. 24 dinner rolls and the sourdough loaves you ordered. Excellent, excellent. Hargrove turned to Francesca with an almost boyish enthusiasm. Have you tried Mr. Reed's bread, Mrs. Dawson, best in 3 counties? We serve it exclusively in our dining room. We've met, Matthew said before she could answer. Mrs. Dawson stayed at my place on her way to town. Hargrove looked between them with interest. Did she now? Well, what a coincidence. Mrs. Dawson has been a tremendous asset to the Silver Palace. Finest bookkeeper I've ever employed. Francesca felt heat rise to her cheeks at the praise. Mr. Hargrove exaggerates. I doubt that, Matthew said, his gaze lingering on her face. Mrs. Dawson struck me as a woman of considerable capability. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of miners, boisterous after a successful day. Hargrove excused himself to attend to them, leaving Francesca and Matthew in an island of relative quiet. You look well, Matthew observed. Silver Creek seems to agree with you. It's been satisfactory, she replied, then added more sincerely, thank you for pointing me in this direction and for your help before. He shrugged. Glad it worked out. He hesitated, then said, I'm in town overnight. Perhaps you would join me for dinner. The hotel restaurant serves a decent steak, I'm told. Francesca's instinct was to refuse. Connections meant complications, and complications inevitably led to questions about her past. But something in Matthew's straightforward gaze made her reconsider. I would like that, she found herself saying. "I finish work at 6. I'll meet you in the lobby at 5:30. When Matthew left to complete his deliveries, Francesca returned to her office, trying to focus on the columns of figures that usually absorbed her completely. Today, however, her mind kept drifting to the upcoming dinner and the man who had extended the invitation. At 6, she closed her ledgers and went to her room to prepare. Her wardrobe was limited, practical rather than fashionable. But she had retained one decent dress from her previous life, a deep blue silk that had survived her journey relatively unscathed. She put it on now, along with the single piece of jewelry she hadn't sold, a simple gold locket containing a tiny portrait of her mother. Looking in the mirror, Francesca barely recognized herself. It had been months since she dressed for anything but practicality. The woman reflected back at her, seemed to belong to another life, one of parlors and social calls, rather than dusty trails and hiding. She arrived in the lobby precisely at 6:30 to find Matthew already waiting. He had clearly made an effort as well, wearing a well-tailored suit that she suspected wasn't often removed from its storage. When he saw her, his expression changed subtly, a mixture of appreciation and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, offering his arm. "You look lovely. Thank you." She accepted his arm, noting the surprised glances from the hotel staff as they entered the dining room together. "I'm afraid I'll be the subject of considerable speculation tomorrow." Matthew smiled. "Would it help if I mentioned that I'm also the hotel's bread supplier, strictly business?" "Perhaps," she replied, returning his smile despite herself. "Though in my experience, people prefer a romantic speculation to a practical truth. And which would you prefer, Mrs. Dawson?" The question, asked lightly but with an undertone of genuine curiosity, caught her off guard. She was saved from answering immediately by the arrival of the waiter, who showed them to a table near the window. Once they were seated and had ordered, Matthew returned to his question with characteristic directness. "You didn't answer me earlier." Francesca smoothed her napkin across her lap. "I've found that romance often complicates matters unnecessarily." "That has not been my experience," he replied, "though admittedly my experience is limited." "You've never been married?" she asked, genuinely curious. Matthew shook his head. "Came close once, about 5 years back. Elizabeth Carver, daughter of a rancher near my place. We courted for nearly a year. What happened? Her father lost the ranch in a card game. The family moved east to live with relatives in Boston." His tone was matter-of-fact, without bitterness. "We wrote for a time, but distance has a way of changing perspectives. She met a banker's son who could offer her more than bread and prairie." "I'm sorry," Francesca said, surprised by his candor. "Don't be. It worked out as it should. Elizabeth wasn't meant for frontier life, though we both believed otherwise at the time." He studied her across the table. "And you?" "If I may ask about Mr. Dawson," Francesca tensed, the familiar lie on the tip of her tongue, but something about Matthew's open honesty made her hesitate. "There is no Mr. Dawson," she said finally. "Not anymore." Matthew nodded, waiting for her to continue if she chose. When she remained silent, he changed the subject smoothly. "Hargrove tells me you've revolutionized his accounting system. He's quite impressed." Grateful for the shift in conversation, Francesca relaxed slightly. "It's not revolutionary, merely organized. Numbers follow logical patterns." "People are far more complicated." "True enough," Matthew agreed as their meals arrived. "Though bread dough can be surprisingly temperamental, affected by weather, humidity, even the mood of the baker, some say." "Do you believe that your mood affects your bread?" He considered the question seriously. "I believe that anything done with care reflects something of the person doing it. My grandmother used to say you could taste love in good food, a romantic notion, but not an entirely false one." He cut into his steak. "The care we take with things matters, whether it's bread or bookkeeping." The conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on books they'd both read, the changing seasons on the frontier, the characters that populated Silver Creek. Matthew was well informed about the world beyond his isolated homestead, subscribing to newspapers from Denver and even Chicago. As they lingered over coffee, Francesca found herself more relaxed than she'd been in months. Matthew had a gift for listening. his questions thoughtful rather than prying. He shared stories of his own life growing up the son of a failed prospector who finally found stability as a ranch hand, learning to bake from his mother who had once worked as a cook in a fine St. Louis home. She believed in education, he told Francesca. Insisted I learn to read and write properly, study mathematics. When other boys were learning to rope cattle, I was reading Shakespeare by lamplight. She sounds remarkable. She was. His expression softened with memory. Died when I was 16. Consumption. Father followed 3 years later a fall from a horse, left me the cabin and not much else. Yet you've built a life for yourself, Francesca observed. We all do what we must. His eyes met hers. Some journeys are just longer and more winding than others. The understanding in his gaze was almost too much to bear. Francesca looked away, suddenly conscious of how much time had passed. The dining room had emptied around them, the staff clearing tables and casting pointed glances their way. It's getting late, she said, gathering her shawl. I should retire. Matthew rose immediately. Of course, thank you for joining me, it's been a pleasure. He escorted her to the stairs that led to the upper floors, pausing at the bottom. I return to town every other Tuesday with deliveries. Perhaps we could make this a regular arrangement. Francesca hesitated, weighing caution against the genuine connection she'd felt during their dinner. I would like that, she said finally. Until next time, then. He took her hand briefly, his touch warm and respectful. Good night, Mrs. Dawson. Good night, Mr. Reed. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Francesca felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. It was dangerous, this feeling. Hope always was. But for tonight, at least, she allowed herself to enjoy it. The next morning brought a return to routine, though Francesca found her thoughts straying periodically to her dinner with Matthew. She spotted him once, loading his wagon in front of the general store, but she was on her way to the bank with hotel business and could only offer a brief nod of acknowledgement as they passed. By afternoon, he had left town, and Silver Creek resumed its normal rhythms. Days passed, then weeks. True to his word, Matthew returned every other Tuesday with his deliveries. Each time they dined together, their conversations growing deeper and more personal. Francesca learned about his dreams of expanding his business, perhaps opening a proper bakery in town someday. She shared carefully edited stories from her own, past her education at a girls' school in Philadelphia, her love of music, her skill with languages. What she didn't share was the truth about her marriage, or the scandal that had forced her to flee St. Louis. Those secrets remained locked away, even as her trust in Matthew grew. It was early October, the aspens turning gold in the mountains, when everything changed. Francesca was working late, reconciling accounts before the month's end, when Hargrove knocked on her office door. Mrs. Dawson, there are gentlemen here to see you, he said, his usual bluster subdued. From St. Louis, her blood ran cold. I'm quite busy, Mr. Hargrove. Perhaps tomorrow. They're most insistent, he interrupted, his expression troubled. They're in my office now. The fear she'd been outrunning for months crashed over her. I see, she said, amazed at how steady her voice sounded when her hands were trembling beneath the desk. I'll be right there. As soon as Hargrove left, Francesca quickly gathered the few personal items she kept in her desk, a small notebook, a fountain pen given to her by her father, the spare hairpins she always had on hand. She slipped them into her pocket, then squared her shoulders and walked to Hargrove's office as if to her execution. 2 men rose as she entered. One she recognized immediately, James Kirkland, her late husband's business partner. The other was unfamiliar, but his bearing suggested law enforcement. Francesca, Kirkland said, his tone falsely warm, you've led us on quite a chase. Mr. Kirkland, she acknowledged coldly. What brings you all the way to Colorado? I believe you know exactly why I'm here. He gestured to his companion. This is Marshall Bennett. He has some questions regarding certain financial irregularities discovered after your hasty departure from St. Louis. Hargrove, who had remained by the door, looked between them with growing alarm. Mrs. Dawson, what is this about? The marshal stepped forward. Mrs. Dawson, or rather Mrs. Kirkland is wanted for questioning in connection with the embezzlement of funds from Kirkland Shipping Company, as well as the suspicious death of her husband, Thomas Kirkland. "That's a lie," Francesca said sharply, her composure finally cracking. "Thomas killed himself after you ruined him, James. You know that as well as I do." Kirkland's face hardened. "The coroner's report suggests otherwise, and the missing funds were stolen by you, not me." She turned to the marshal. Thomas discovered that his partner had been siphoning money from the company for years. When he confronted him, James threatened to expose Thomas's gambling debts to the board. "The next day, my husband shot himself in his study." "A convenient story," Kirkland sneered. "But the ledgers tell a different tale. Ledgers in your handwriting, my dear." "Forged," Francesca insisted, though she knew how weak it sounded. The evidence had been carefully arranged against her, a woman alone against one of St. Louis's most respected businessmen. Hargrove, who had been listening with increasing distress, finally spoke. "Surely there's been some mistake. Mrs. Dawson has been an exemplary employee. I'm afraid her skill with numbers has been put to nefarious use before," Kirkland interrupted smoothly. "She's quite clever, our Francesca." The marshal moved forward. "Mrs. Kirkland, I need you to come with us. We'll be taking the morning train back to Denver, then on to St. Louis." Francesca's mind raced, calculating options, escape routes, possibilities. She had known this day might come, had prepared as best she could, but the reality was more terrifying than she'd imagined. "May I collect my belongings?" she asked, striving for dignity. The marshal nodded, under supervision. As they escorted her upstairs, hotel guests and staff watching with undisguised curiosity, Francesca fought to maintain her composure. In her room, she mechanically gathered the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind her mother's locket, a small volume of poetry, the blue dress. "You'll be held at the sheriff's office tonight," the marshal informed her as they led her back downstairs. "We leave at first light." The walk through town to the sheriff's office was the longest of Francesca's life. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached their destination, faces lined the boardwalks, watching the spectacle of the respectable Mrs. Dawson under escort. The sheriff, a gruff man named Hollister, seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but provided a small, clean cell with a cot and blanket. "Best I can do, madam," he said apologetically as he locked the door. "The deputy will bring you some supper shortly." Left alone, Francesca finally allowed her carefully maintained facade to crumble. She sank onto the cot, hands covering her face, and wept silently. It was over. Everything she had built here, the precarious safety she had found, all destroyed in an instant. She had no illusions about what awaited her in St. Louis. Kirkland had connections throughout the city, influence with judges and officials. Even if she could somehow prove her innocence regarding the embezzlement, the shadow over Thomas's death would never lift. At best, she faced years in prison, at worst the gallows. As twilight deepened into night, Francesca dried her tears and began to plan. There had to be a way out, some path forward that didn't end in a St. Louis courtroom. She was still deep in thought when the deputy brought a tray with a bowl of stew and a piece of bread. The bread caught her attention immediately. It wasn't the usual fare from the town's mediocre restaurant, but a familiar sourdough with a distinctive crust. Matthew's bread. Her pulse quickened. Had Matthew heard about her arrest? Was he in town? The questions were answered moments later when the deputy slipped her a folded note along with the tray. "From the baker," he muttered. "Don't tell the sheriff." Francesca waited until he'd left before unfolding the paper. The message was brief. "Back window lock is broken. Midnight, horse waiting in the alley." Hope flared briefly, then dimmed as she considered the consequences. If she fled now, she would be not just a suspected embezzler and possible murderer, but a confirmed fugitive. She would never stop running, yet the alternative was certain ruin. At least escape offered a chance, however slim. As midnight approached, Francesca listened to the sounds of the small jail settling for the night. The sheriff had gone home, leaving only the young deputy on duty. She could hear him in the front office, his chair creaking as he dozed. Moving silently, she tested the window. As promised, the lock was broken not obviously, but enough that with careful manipulation, the latch gave way. The window itself was small, but Francesca was slender and desperation lent her strength. She squeezed through the opening, dropping quietly into the narrow alley behind the jail. A horse stood tethered nearby, saddled and ready. There was no sign of Matthew, but a small pack attached to the saddle contained provisions and, most precious of all, a small pouch of money. Francesca mounted quickly, guiding the horse at a walk until they were well away from the sheriff's office. Only then did she urge the animal into a trot, heading not west toward the mountains, but east, back the way she had originally come. It would be the last direction they would expect her to go. She rode through the night, pushing the horse as hard as she dared over the unfamiliar terrain. By dawn, she had covered enough ground to risk a brief rest. Finding a sheltered spot by a small creek, she allowed the horse to drink while she examined the provisions Matthew had provided. Besides food and money, there was a man's shirt and trousers, a wide-brimmed hat, and a small pistol with ammunition. The message was clear. Disguise herself, stay armed, keep moving. Francesca changed quickly, binding her breasts with a strip of cloth and tucking her hair up under the hat. The transformation wasn't perfect, but in the dim light of dawn or dusk, she might pass for a slender young man from a distance. She continued east throughout the day, avoiding the main trails and keeping to the cover of trees where possible. By nightfall, she was exhausted but determined to put more distance between herself and Silver Creek. It was only when the horse began to stumble with fatigue that she finally stopped, making a cold camp in a dense grove of pines. As she huddled beneath a blanket, too tense to sleep despite her exhaustion, Francesca wondered about Matthew. Why had he helped her? What had he heard about the charges against her? And where was he now? The answers came 3 days later as she made her way cautiously across the prairie, keeping to low ground and traveling mainly at night. She had just made camp in the shelter of a small ravine when she heard the approach of a rider. Francesca reached for the pistol, her heart pounding. She had seen no one for days, had carefully avoided the few homesteads she'd passed. Who could have tracked her here? The rider appeared at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the setting sun. Even before he spoke, she recognized the broad shoulders and easy posture. Mrs. Dawson, Matthew called softly. Or do you prefer Kirkland now? She kept the pistol raised. How did you find me? He dismounted, leading his horse down into the ravine. I know these lands better than most, and I guessed you'd head east initially to throw them off. Why help me escape only to track me down? Matthew stopped a respectful distance away, hands slightly raised to show he meant no harm. Because running forever is no kind of life, and because I believe your version of events more than Kirkland's. Francesca lowered the gun slightly. You heard. The whole town heard. Kirkland made quite a spectacle of it. His expression darkened. I was delivering to the hotel when they brought you in, stayed in town, asked questions. Kirkland's story has holes, Francesca. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it affected her more than she wanted to admit. It doesn't matter. His word against mine, and he's a respected businessman while I'm just a woman who deserves justice, Matthew interrupted firmly. And maybe I can help with that. How? He moved closer slowly, as if approaching a skittish horse. I recognized Kirkland's name. My mother worked for his family before she married my father. She kept in touch with friends in that household. There were rumors even then about young James's character. Hope, dangerous and fragile, flickered in Francesca's chest. That was years ago. It won't help me now. Perhaps not directly, but it's a starting point. Matthew finally reached her side, gently taking the pistol from her hand. Come back with me to my place. It's safe there, and we can figure this out together. Why would you risk harboring a fugitive? They'll come looking eventually. Matthew's eyes, steady and certain in the fading light, held hers. Because in the months I've known you, I've seen your character, your integrity. And because he hesitated, then continued more softly, because I care what happens to you, Francesca. More than I should, perhaps. The simple declaration, spoken without drama or expectation, broke something inside her. Tears she'd been holding back for days spilled over. I didn't do it, she whispered. Any of it. Thomas was a flawed man, but he was kind to me in his way. I would never have hurt him. I believe you, Matthew said, and reached for her hand. That night, they made camp together, speaking in low voices as Matthew shared what he'd learned in Silver Creek after her escape. The marshal was furious, convinced she'd had outside help. Posses had been sent west, toward the mountains and California, beyond exactly as Matthew had anticipated. "They'll search my place eventually," he acknowledged. "But not immediately. They think I'm just the baker who happened to be making a delivery that day, no connection to you beyond serving you bread." "We had dinner together regularly," Francesca reminded him. "People saw us." "A business arrangement," I told them. "You were helping me organize my accounts in exchange for meals." He smiled slightly. "Hargrove backed me up, surprisingly. I think he's not convinced of your guilt either." By morning, they had formulated a plan. They would return to Matthew's cabin by a circuitous route, avoiding main trails. Francesca would remain hidden there while Matthew made discreet inquiries through his mother's old connections in St. Louis. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The journey took 3 days, during which they traveled mainly at night. Matthew proved to be a skilled woodsman, finding game for their meals and ensuring they left minimal traces of their passage. They spoke little during the day, conserving energy for the night's travel, but in the evenings around their small, carefully shielded fires, the conversations that had begun in Silver Creek deepened. Francesca told him the full story of her marriage to Thomas Kirkland, an arrangement more of convenience than passion, though not without affection. Thomas had been 20 years her senior, a widower seeking a wife with education and social graces to help advance his business interests. She had been the daughter of a professor whose death had left the family in difficult circumstances. "It wasn't a love match," she admitted, "but we respected each other." When Thomas realized what James had been doing with the company funds, he was devastated. Not just by the betrayal, but by his own failure to see it earlier. "And the night he died?" Matthew asked gently. Francesca closed her eyes, the memory still painful. "We argued. I wanted him to go to the authorities, expose James regardless of the consequences. Thomas feared the scandal would destroy what remained of the business. He'd been drinking heavily for weeks." She swallowed hard. "I went to bed angry. In the morning, I found him in his study with a pistol in his hand." "I'm sorry," Matthew said simply. "That's a terrible burden to carry alone." James arrived within the hour with a constable. He claimed I had threatened Thomas the night before, that I had been embezzling funds and Thomas had discovered it. Her voice hardened. "By evening, half of St. Louis society believed I had murdered my husband to cover my crimes. So you ran." "I had no choice. James had the ledgers altered to implicate me and witnesses willing to swear they'd heard me threaten Thomas. My own maid, bribed or coerced, said she'd seen me with the pistol." Francesca looked at him directly. "I took what money I had in my own name and fled that night." Matthew was silent for a long moment, absorbing her story. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand. "We'll find a way to prove your innocence." "How?" she asked, not pulling away. "It's been months. Any evidence that might have helped me is long gone." "Not necessarily." "People talk. Secrets leave traces." His grip tightened reassuringly. "And James Kirkland doesn't know we're looking." On the 4th day, as dusk was falling, they finally reached Matthew's cabin. It stood just as Francesca remembered it, smoke curling from the chimney, a detail that made Matthew tense. "I didn't leave a fire burning," he murmured, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay here with the horses until I check." Before he could move, the cabin door opened, and a figure stepped onto the porch, a man of medium height with a sheriff's badge gleaming on his chest. "That's Hollister," Francesca whispered, recognizing the Silver Creek sheriff. "They've found us." Matthew considered their options quickly. "Too late to run. We'll have to face this." He turned to her, his expression grave but determined. "Trust me, after everything, there was only one answer." "Yes." They approached the cabin openly, Matthew slightly ahead with his hands visible, Francesca close behind. As they neared, Sheriff Hollister raised a hand in greeting, his posture relaxed rather than threatening. "Evening, Reed," he called. "Took you long enough to get back." Matthew's step faltered slightly, then resumed. "Sheriff, this is unexpected." Hollister's gaze moved to Francesca, recognition dawning despite her male attire. "Mrs. Kirkland or Dawson, whichever you prefer." "Sheriff," she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. "I assume you're here to arrest me." To her surprise, Hollister shook his head. "Not exactly, madam." "Mind if we talk inside? Been waiting most of the day and it's getting cold." Confused but with few alternatives, they followed him into the cabin. The interior was warm and smelled of coffee. A pot bubbled on the stove, and 3 cups had been set out on the table. "Make yourselves comfortable," Hollister said, pouring the coffee. "You look like you could use this." Matthew remained standing, his posture wary. "What's this about, Sheriff?" Hollister settled into a chair with a sigh. "About justice, I hope, and clearing up a mess." He looked at Francesca. "That marshal who came for you. Bennett, he's no marshal. Real name's George Simmons, hired gun with a talent for forgery, including federal badges." Francesca's knees weakened and she sank into a chair. "What?" "Got a telegram from the actual federal marshal in Denver 3 days after you escaped. He'd received inquiries about a Marshal Bennett operating in our area. No such person on their roster." Hollister sipped his coffee. "Started asking questions about your friend Kirkland after that. Turns out he's not as respectable as he appears." "You believe me," Francesca whispered. "Let's say I'm inclined to investigate further." Hollister set down his cup. "Kirkland and his false marshal left town the morning after your escape, heading back to St. Louis. But they left enough loose ends for a curious sheriff to tug on." Over the next hour, Hollister outlined what he'd discovered. A young clerk at the Silver Creek Bank had overheard Kirkland discussing a substantial property purchase in Mexico. Strange business for a man supposedly pursuing justice for his murdered partner. The hotel maid who had cleaned Kirkland's room had found drafts of telegrams suggesting he was liquidating assets quickly. "Man's running," Hollister concluded. "Question is, from what or whom?" "The truth," Francesca said firmly. "If someone looked closely enough at the company books, the real ones, not the altered versions, they'd find evidence of his embezzlement. And those books would be where? Thomas kept duplicate ledgers in a safe at our home. It was his insurance, though he never got to use it." She frowned. "But James would have found those by now." "Unless he didn't know where to look," Matthew suggested. "Would your husband have shared that location with his partner?" Francesca considered. "No, Thomas was careful. The safe was hidden behind a painting in our bedroom, a landscape of the Missouri River that had belonged to his first wife. James rarely came to the house and never upstairs." Hollister leaned forward. "If those ledgers still exist, they'd be powerful evidence. But how would we get them?" Francesca asked. "The house has surely been sold by now, or at least cleared of my belongings." "Perhaps not," Hollister said. "According to what I've heard, Kirkland has been claiming that, as the surviving partner, he's entitled to Thomas's assets until you're brought to justice. Legal maneuvering to buy time, I'd guess." Matthew, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "So the house might still be as it was, the safe untouched, it's possible," Hollister acknowledged. "But someone would need to go to St. Louis to find out." "I'll go," Matthew said immediately. Francesca turned to him in alarm. "That's too dangerous. James knows your face now. He saw me once briefly as a baker delivering bread. He won't remember me." Matthew's expression was resolute. "And I have connections there through my mother's former employers." "It's still a risk," Hollister warned. "If Kirkland is desperate enough to hire a fake marshal, he's desperate enough to eliminate anyone who threatens him. Which is why I need to go soon, before he realizes we're onto him." Matthew looked at Francesca. "Do you remember exactly where the safe is?" "How to open it?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, but Matthew, I can't let you do this. It's my fight." "It became mine the moment they came for you," he replied simply. Then, with a hint of his usual humor, "Besides, St. Louis has a thriving bakery scene. I've always wanted to study their techniques." Hollister cleared his throat. "I should note that officially I'm still obligated to bring Mrs. Kirkland in. There's a warrant, even if it was served by a fraudulent marshal." "And unofficially?" Matthew asked. "Unofficially, I'll be busy with a dispute over at the Henderson Ranch for the next week or so. Terrible timing, but these things happen." The sheriff stood, setting his empty cup on the table. "If evidence clearing misses, Kirkland should appear during that time, well, that would certainly change the official position." As Hollister prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing. Your deputy in Silver Creek, Jimmy Farrell, he mentioned helping a lady escape on the night in question. Said a baker paid him $20 to look the other way." Matthew met his gaze steadily. "Sounds like a man with poor judgment." Or good instincts, Hollister replied. Take care, both of you. I'll check back in a week. After the sheriff left, Francesca and Matthew sat in silence for several minutes, processing the unexpected turn of events. Do you trust him? Francesca finally asked. Hollister, yes, I think so. He's straight as they come. Matthew stoked the fire, adding another log. The question is, do you trust me to go to St. Louis? It's not a matter of trust, she said softly. It's about risk. If anything happened to you because of me, that would be my choice, he interrupted gently. As it was my choice to help you escape and to find you afterward. Francesca studied his face in the firelight, seeing the determination there, the quiet strength she had come to rely on. Why, Matthew? Why risk so much for someone you barely know? He was silent for a moment, arranging his thoughts. When I was a boy, he began, my father was accused of stealing from the mine where he worked. It wasn't true he was being framed by a foreman with a grudge, but no one would listen to a failed prospector with a reputation for wild claims about silver strikes. What happened? He was about to be arrested when the mine owner's wife spoke up. She had seen the foreman planting the stolen items in my father's things. She risked her standing, her husband's anger, to tell the truth. Matthew's eyes met Francesca's. That woman was your mother-in-law, Thomas Kirkland's first wife. She saved my father from prison, maybe worse. Francesca stared at him, stunned. You knew, all this time you knew who I was. Not until Kirkland arrived in Silver Creek, the name triggered the memory. He reached across the table, taking her hand. But that's not why I helped you, Francesca. I helped you because I saw the same integrity in you that Mrs. Kirkland showed all those years ago. And because he hesitated, then continued more softly, because somewhere between your first arrival here and our dinners in Silver Creek, I fell in love with you. The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Francesca felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and fear and something else, something she had thought she might never feel again. Matthew, she began, but he shook his head. You don't need to say anything, not now with everything unsettled. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. Let's focus on clearing your name first. The rest can wait. They spent the next day preparing for Matthew's journey. Francesca drew detailed maps of the Kirkland home, marking the location of the safe and writing out the combination. They discussed possible approaches, contingencies, ways to contact each other if things went wrong. I'll send telegrams to Sheriff Hollister using our agreed-upon code, Matthew explained. If you need to leave here for any reason, leave a message with Pastor Wilson in Silver Creek. He's discreet and has no love for Kirkland after the man insulted his wife's preserves at the county fair. Despite the seriousness of their planning, the anecdote made Francesca smile. It was so typical of Matthew to remember such a human detail, to understand the complex web of relationships that defined frontier communities. As evening approached, Matthew needed dough for bread, the familiar ritual seemingly calming for him. Francesca watched his strong hands work the dough with practiced motions, shaping it with care before setting it to rise by the fire. I'll miss your bread, she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the worry that gnawed at her. Matthew glanced up with a small smile. I'll be back before this loaf goes stale. Promise, his hands stilled. I promise to do everything in my power to return to you, Francesca, with the evidence we need or without it. The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. I'll hold you to that, Mr. Reed. Later, as they sat before the fire eating the fresh bread with stew, Francesca found herself studying Matthew's profile, memorizing the lines of his face, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. The thought of him traveling to St. Louis, putting himself in danger for her sake, filled her with both gratitude and dread. Tell me about your plans, she said suddenly. After all this is over, you mentioned a bakery in town. Matthew looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. It's been a dream for some time. A proper bakery with a stone oven and maybe a small cafe attached, somewhere people could gather, break bread together. It sounds wonderful. The cabin would still be home, though, he added. I'd keep it right out each morning before dawn. There's something about this place, the quiet, the connection to the land. I can understand that, Francesca said softly. It feels safe here. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted between them, a recognition of shared feelings, shared hopes that neither was quite ready to name. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Matthew prepared to leave, packing lightly for the journey to Denver, where he would catch the eastbound train. Francesca had spent the night adding details to her maps and writing a letter evidence of her innocence that Matthew could present if necessary. As he saddled his horse, Francesca stood by, a wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "There's enough firewood stacked by the door to last a month," Matthew told her, checking the cinch. "Plenty of provisions in the root cellar. If you need anything else, Pastor Wilson's wife can help. I'll be fine," she assured him. "It's you I'm worried about." Matthew secured his saddlebags, then turned to face her. In the clear morning light, his eyes were the deep blue of mountain lakes, steady and certain. "Francesca," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. Instead of speaking further, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her hand. "I want you to have this." It was a key, old, heavy, clearly hand-forged. "What is it?" "The key to this place." His voice was husky with emotion. "It was my father's, then mine. Now it's yours, whatever happens." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just a practical matter of access, but a symbol of trust, of belonging, of a future. "Matthew," she whispered, closing her fingers around the key. "I can't, you can," he said simply. "This is your home now if you want it to be, a place where your past doesn't matter, where you can start again." Overwhelmed, Francesca did the only thing that felt right in that moment. She stepped forward and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the words she couldn't yet say. Matthew's arms came around her, strong and sure, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'll come back to you," he promised. "However long it takes. I'll be here," she replied, and knew it was true. Whatever happened in St. Louis, whatever the outcome of their quest for justice, this place, this man had become her anchor in a storm-tossed life. With one last embrace, Matthew mounted his horse. Francesca stood watching until he disappeared from view, the key clutched tightly in her hand like a talisman against uncertainty. The days that followed were a strange mixture of tension and peace. Francesca settled into the rhythms of life at the cabin, finding comfort in simple tasks. She tended the sourdough starter Matthew had left, baking bread that never quite matched his but improved with each attempt. She chopped wood, drew water from the well, gathered late-season berries from bushes near the creek. In the evenings, she read from Matthew's collection of books, discovering his favorites by the worn spines and occasional notes in the margins. Dickens, Whitman, Shakespeare, his tastes were eclectic and thoughtful. One volume of Tennyson contained pressed wildflowers between certain pages, each seemingly marking a passage of particular significance. A week passed, then 10 days. Hollister visited as promised, bringing news from Silver Creek. Kirkland's false marshal was now wanted in 3 states for similar deceptions, and supplies from town. He also brought a telegram from Denver, the agreed-upon signal that Matthew had safely reached the city and boarded the train east. "Reed's a good man," Hollister commented as he prepared to leave. "Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Steadiest fellow I ever met." "Yes," Francesca agreed simply. "He is." The sheriff studied her face for a moment. "When this is all sorted out, you two planning to make it official?" The directness of the question startled her. "We haven't, that is, he hasn't," Hollister chuckled. "Hasn't asked yet, maybe, but he will." His expression grew more serious. "Community would welcome you, Mrs. Dawson. Once the truth's known, folks around here value character over history." The words stayed with Francesca long after Hollister had gone, echoing in her mind as she went about her daily tasks. Could it be that simple? Could she truly start again, not as a woman in hiding but as herself, perhaps eventually as Matthew's wife? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her marriage to Thomas had been comfortable but passionless, a partnership of mutual benefit rather than deep affection. What she felt for Matthew was entirely different, a connection that had grown from respect to friendship to something far more profound. 2 weeks after Matthew's departure, Francesca was in the garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Heart racing, she straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. It wasn't Matthew. Two riders approached, neither familiar. Instinctively, Francesca reached for the pistol she now kept in her apron pocket, backing toward the cabin. The riders stopped a respectful distance away. One, an older man with a silver beard, raised his hand in greeting. "Mrs. Kirkland, or do you prefer Dawson now? Who's asking?" she called, her hand still on the pistol. "Name's Abernathy. Judge Elias Abernathy from Denver." He gestured to his companion, a younger man in a smart suit. "This is Mr. Townsend from the U.S. Marshal's office. We'd like to speak with you if we may." A federal judge and a real marshal. Francesca's hope sank. "Have you come to arrest me?" "No, madam," Judge Abernathy replied, dismounting stiffly. "We've come to hear your side of the story." "Directly from you." Cautiously, Francesca invited them inside. As they settled at the table, she offered coffee, falling back on the social graces that had once been second nature. "I assume Sheriff Hollister told you where to find me," she said as she poured. "Actually, it was your friend Mr. Reed," the marshal replied. "He's in St. Louis now, working with authorities there." Francesca nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Matthew, he's working with the authorities. I don't understand." Judge Abernathy accepted his cup with a nod of thanks. "Mr. Reed arrived in St. Louis 2 days ago. Instead of attempting to enter the Kirkland residence himself, he went directly to an old friend of his mother's who happens to be married to a detective with the St. Louis police." "Smart man, your Baker," Marshal Townsend commented. "He presented your case, including the details about the hidden ledgers, to people who could legally access the property." Hope, so dangerous and fragile, began to bloom in Francesca's chest. "And did they find them, the ledgers?" "They did," the judge confirmed. "Along with correspondence between James Kirkland and several questionable business associates. The evidence suggests a pattern of embezzlement dating back at least 5 years." "And James?" Francesca asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Arrested yesterday morning," Marshal Townsend said. "He was attempting to board a steamer bound for Mexico, had quite a substantial sum with him, along with a new identity." Francesca sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Then it's over. The charges against me." "Being dropped as we speak," the judge assured her. "Your formal statement today will complete the process. Mr. Reed was quite insistent that we bring the news to you personally, along with this." He handed her an envelope bearing the seal of the St. Louis Circuit Court. With trembling fingers, Francesca broke the seal and unfolded the document inside an official declaration of her innocence, signed by the presiding judge. "There's more," Marshal Townsend added. "Kirkland's former clerk has come forward with information suggesting he may have tampered with your husband's pistol before the incident. The case is being reopened as a potential murder investigation." The revelation struck Francesca like a physical blow. James might have killed Thomas. "Not just driven him to suicide, it's being investigated," the judge said gently. "The truth will come out, Mrs. Kirkland, all of it." For a moment, Francesca couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the implications. Thomas's death, which had haunted her for months, might not have been the act of despair she'd believed, but something far darker. The grief she'd carried, complicated by guilt over their final argument, shifted into something else, a sorrow no less profound, but somehow cleaner, less tangled with regret. "And Matthew?" she finally asked. "Is he safe? When will he return?" "He's completing some business in St. Louis," the marshal explained. "The Kirkland estate, your estate, now needs attention, but he sent a message." From his pocket, he withdrew a small folded paper and handed it to Francesca. Unlike the formal court document, this was written in Matthew's familiar hand on plain stationery. The message was brief but made her heart soar. "Justice done. Coming home to you. Set the table." 3 weeks later, as the first snow of winter dusted the mountains, Francesca stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the trail that led from town. She had received word yesterday via Pastor Wilson that Matthew would arrive today. His business in St. Louis finally complete. The cabin gleamed with fresh cleaning. A stew simmered on the stove. and a loaf of bread her best effort yet cooled on the table she had set with care, using the cabin's simple dishes supplemented with a few items she'd purchased in Silver Creek. So much had changed in the month since Matthew had left. Her name had been cleared completely, the truth about James Kirkland's crimes published in newspapers as far away as Chicago. Thomas's death had indeed been ruled a murder, though James maintained his innocence on that charge despite overwhelming evidence of his financial crimes. The Kirkland estate, restored to Francesca as Thomas's rightful heir, was substantial even after James's embezzlement. She had instructed the family attorney to sell the St. Louis house and most of its contents, keeping only a few personal items and family heirlooms that had meant something to Thomas. The business had been sold to a consortium of investors, with a portion of the proceeds dedicated to a fund for the employees who had suffered under James's mismanagement. The rest, a fortune by frontier standards, was now secured in Francesca's name, offering freedom and possibilities she had never expected to have again. Yet as she waited for Matthew's return, it wasn't the restored wealth or status that filled her thoughts but simpler things. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful attention he gave to everything he touched, the sense of peace she felt in his presence. The sound of hoofbeats broke into her reverie. A rider appeared on the trail, and even at a distance, she would know that straight-backed figure anywhere. Francesca's heart leaped as Matthew urged his horse into a trot for the final approach to the cabin. He looked tired but triumphant as he dismounted, his face lighting with joy when he saw her waiting. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other across the yard, drinking in the sight after so long apart. Then Francesca was moving, and so was he, meeting halfway in an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. His arms were strong around her, his cheek rough against hers as he murmured her name like a prayer. "You're really here," she whispered, pulling back just enough to see his face. "You're safe." "I promised I'd come back to you," Matthew replied, his voice husky with emotion, "and I keep my promises." Inside the cabin, as snow began to fall more heavily outside, they sat at the table Francesca had set with such care. Matthew broke the bread she had baked, an unconscious echo of communion that seemed fitting for this moment of new beginnings. "It's good," he said after tasting it, genuine appreciation in his voice. "You've been practicing." "I had an excellent teacher," she replied, smiling at him across the table. As they shared the meal, Matthew told her about his time in St. Louis, the investigation, the evidence that had finally brought James Kirkland to justice, the respectful farewell he had paid at Thomas's grave on Francesca's behalf. "The house is sold," he reported. "Most of the proceeds have been transferred to the bank in Denver, with a smaller account set up in Silver Creek for immediate needs." "You've thought of everything," Francesca said softly. "I tried to." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "There's one more thing. I found this in Thomas's study, in a drawer that had been overlooked during the initial investigation." He placed a small leather-bound book on the table. Francesca recognized it immediately, Thomas's personal journal, which he had kept faithfully for years. "I didn't read it," Matthew assured her. "But I thought you might want to have it, to understand him better, perhaps." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Francesca's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the worn cover gently, "for everything." As the evening deepened into night, they moved to sit before the fire, the comfortable silence between them filled with unspoken feelings. Finally, Matthew turned to her, his expression serious. "Francesca, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart quickened. "Yes." "Your life has changed dramatically. You're a wealthy woman now, free to go anywhere, do anything." He met her gaze directly. "What do you want to do with that freedom?" Of all the questions she had anticipated, this wasn't one of them. She considered it carefully, aware of its importance. "When I first ran from St. Louis," she began slowly, "all I wanted was safety. Then, when James found me, all I wanted was justice, now that I have both." She looked around the simple cabin that had become more home to her than the grand house in St. Louis had ever been. "Now I want what I've found here: peace, purpose, connection." Matthew's eyes never left her face. "And where do you want to find those things?" "Here," she said simply. "With you, if that's what you want too." The vulnerability in her voice seemed to break something open in Matthew. He reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. "Francesca Dawson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I've loved you since that first night you sat at my table, tired and wary but still so full of dignity and strength. I loved you through our dinners in Silver Creek, through your arrest and escape, through every moment we've been apart." He took a deep breath. "I want to build a life with you here in town, wherever you wish to be. I want to wake up beside you every morning and bake bread for you every day and face whatever comes, good or bad, together." Tears spilled down Francesca's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Are you asking me to marry you, Matthew Reed?" "I am," he confirmed, a smile breaking through his serious expression. "Though I'm making a mess of it." I had a whole speech prepared, but Francesca silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her answer into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Silver Creek, with Sheriff Hollister giving the bride away and Pastor Wilson officiating. The whole town turned out for the celebration, curious to see the woman whose story had become something of a local legend. To Francesca's surprise, she was welcomed warmly. The frontier valued resilience and truth, and her story, now fully known and vindicated, embodied both. Matthew's standing in the community certainly helped, but there was also a genuine acceptance that moved her deeply. "Told you folks here judge character over history," Hollister murmured as he escorted her down the aisle to where Matthew waited, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him in his best suit. The celebration afterward was held at the Silver Palace Hotel, with Mr. Hargrove insisting on hosting the event as a wedding gift. There was music and dancing, and at the center of the feast, a magnificent wedding cake baked by Matthew himself in the hotel's kitchen the day before. As winter settled over Colorado, the newlyweds established a rhythm to their life together. They divided their time between the cabin, which remained their primary home, and a small apartment above the bakery Matthew opened in Silver Creek, using a portion of Francesca's inheritance as capital. The bakery thrived, becoming a gathering place for the community just as Matthew had envisioned. Francesca discovered a talent for the business side of the operation, keeping the books with the same precision she had brought to the hotel's accounts, but now with the satisfaction of building something that was truly their own. In the evenings, whether at the cabin or in town, they would sit together reading, talking, planning for the future. Sometimes Matthew would play his mother's old guitar, singing songs from his childhood in a rich baritone that never failed to move Francesca. Other times, they would simply sit in companionable silence, Matthew kneading dough for the next day's bread while Francesca wrote in her journal or worked on the quilt she was making for their bed. It was during one such evening, as spring began to soften the winter landscape, that Francesca set aside her sewing and looked at her husband with a mixture of nervousness and joy. "Matthew," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from his bread, flour dusting his forearms. "What is it, love?" The doctor confirmed it today. She rested a hand on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a child, in late autumn." The wonder that spread across Matthew's face was everything she had hoped for. He was beside her in an instant, kneeling by her chair, his hand covering hers. "A baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his expression made the question unnecessary. "Beyond happy," he assured her, gathering her into his arms. "Beyond anything I could have imagined." As Matthew held her, his strong hands gentle against her back, Francesca felt the final pieces of her past slide away. The girl who had married for security in St. Louis, the woman who had fled in fear across the prairie, they were part of her story, but no longer defined her. Here, in this simple cabin with the man who had believed in her when no one else would, she had found not just safety or justice, but something far more precious. A love that asked for nothing but offered everything. A place where her past was acknowledged but not held against her. A future limited only by the horizon. Outside, the first wildflowers of spring pushed through the melting snow, reaching for the light. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Francesca and Matthew planned for their child, for the bakery, for the life they would build together, a life as rich and nourishing as the bread he baked each day, as honest and enduring as the love that had brought them through darkness into light. And when their daughter was born that October, with her father's blue-gray eyes and her mother's determined spirit, they named her Hope, for that was what they had given each other, and what they wished for her. The courage to face whatever came, the strength to begin again when necessary, and the wisdom to recognize home when she found it. In the years that followed, as the bakery expanded and more children joined their family, Francesca often thought of that first night at Matthew's table, how a simple act of kindness, a loaf of bread shared without judgment, had changed the course of her life. She had arrived with nothing but a past no one would forgive. He had made bread, set the table, and let love in. And in doing so, they had created something neither could have found alone. A life where the past informed but did not dictate the future, where each day was an opportunity to nourish others as they had been nourished, where love was not just an emotion but a choice made again and again, as steady and sustaining as the daily bread that graced their table.